Marcus Thompson adjusted his camera strap as he stepped off the tour bus at Buckingham Palace. The 28-year-old marketing executive from Denver had saved for 2 years to take this European vacation, and London was the crown jewel of his itinerary. The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as tourists gathered in clusters, phones and cameras, ready to capture the famous changing of the guard ceremony. "First time in London?" asked Sarah, a middle-aged woman from Australia who had struck up a conversation with Marcus on the bus. "Yeah, and I'm determined to get the perfect shot," Marcus replied, patting his expensive digital camera. "My Instagram followers are expecting something spectacular." The crowd began to buzz with excitement as the distinctive red-uniformed guards appeared in the distance. Marcus pushed forward, weaving through the mass of people until he found himself near the front of the barriers. The guards marched with mechanical precision, their tall black bearskin hats creating an imposing silhouette against the palace walls. Marcus raised his camera and began snapping photos. The guards' faces were stoic, almost statue-like in their composure. Their rifles gleamed in the sunlight, and their polished boots moved in perfect synchronization. He had heard stories about these guards, how they were trained not to react to anything, how they stood motionless for hours, regardless of weather or distraction. "Look at them," Marcus whispered to Sarah. "They're like robots. I bet nothing could make them break character." As the ceremony continued, Marcus noticed one guard in particular. The young man appeared to be around his own age, with sharp features visible beneath the shadow of his bearskin hat. His blue eyes stared straight ahead with unwavering focus. Marcus found himself fascinated by the guard's discipline and began taking multiple shots of him specifically. The official ceremony concluded after about 45 minutes, but several guards remained at their posts around the palace grounds. Marcus wandered around, still snapping photos and observing the guards' behavior. He watched as tourists attempted various antics, making funny faces, waving frantically, even jumping up and down. But the guards remained completely unmoved. "It's incredible," Marcus said to Sarah, who had remained nearby. "They really don't react to anything." "That's what makes them so famous," Sarah replied. "It takes years of training to develop that kind of discipline." As the morning progressed, Marcus found himself increasingly intrigued by the idea of testing the guards' resolve. He had seen countless videos online of tourists trying to make the guards laugh or break character, usually without success. The idea of going viral with a successful attempt began to take root in his mind. Around noon, Marcus decided to take a break and grabbed coffee from a nearby vendor. The hot beverage warmed his hands as he continued to observe the guards. One guard, the same young man he had photographed earlier, stood perfectly still near the palace gates. His name tag read Thompson, a coincidence that Marcus found amusing given their shared surname. "Another Thompson," Marcus chuckled to himself. "Maybe we're distant relatives." As Marcus sipped his coffee, he began brainstorming ways to get a reaction from Guard Thompson. He had heard that the guards were allowed to speak under certain circumstances, particularly if someone was being genuinely disruptive or posed a threat. But he wanted something more creative, something that would make for a great story back home. The coffee was particularly hot that day, steaming in the cool London air. Marcus held the cup carefully, feeling the warmth through the cardboard sleeve. An idea began forming in his mind, not a malicious one, but what he considered a harmless prank that might finally crack the guard's composure. Marcus approached Guard Thompson slowly, staying well within the designated tourist areas. The guard's eyes remained fixed straight ahead, showing no acknowledgement of Marcus's presence despite being only a few feet away. Marcus pulled out his phone and began recording, thinking this would be perfect content for his social media accounts. "Excuse me," Marcus said in a normal voice. The guard didn't respond, as expected. "I said, 'Excuse me, sir.'" Still nothing. Marcus felt emboldened by the lack of reaction. He looked around and noticed that other tourists were watching him with interest. Some had their phones out, apparently anticipating some kind of confrontation. Marcus felt the pressure to deliver something entertaining. "You know," Marcus said louder, "I bet you're dying for some coffee on a day like this." The guard remained motionless, but Marcus thought he detected the slightest twitch in the man's jaw. Encouraged, he continued his one-sided conversation. "This is really good coffee," Marcus said, holding up his cup. "Fresh from that vendor over there. Bet you haven't had a break in hours." A small crowd was gathering now, drawn by Marcus's increasingly loud commentary. He felt like a performer with an audience, and the adrenaline began to pump through his veins. The guard maintained his position, rifle at his side, eyes forward. Marcus took another sip of his coffee and made an exaggerated mmm sound. "So warm and delicious. Really hits the spot on a chilly day like this." He was speaking loudly enough now that other guards and palace security personnel were beginning to take notice. The crowd around Marcus had grown to about 20 people, all watching the exchange with varying degrees of amusement and concern. Someone in the crowd called out, "Leave him alone, mate!" But Marcus was too caught up in the moment to pay attention. "You know what?" Marcus announced to his impromptu audience. "I think our friend here could use some warming up." Before anyone could react, before Marcus himself fully processed what he was about to do, he stepped forward and tossed the remaining contents of his coffee cup directly at Guard Thompson's chest. The hot liquid splashed across the red wool uniform, creating a dark stain that spread quickly across the fabric. Steam rose from the soaked material as the coffee soaked in. The crowd gasped collectively, some people shouting in shock and disapproval. Guard Thompson's reaction was immediate but controlled. His head turned slowly toward Marcus, blue eyes now focusing directly on him, with an intensity that made Marcus's stomach drop. The guard's jaw tightened. And for the first time since Marcus had been watching, the man's composure showed cracks. "Sir," Guard Thompson said, in a crisp, authoritative voice that cut through the morning air, "you have just committed an assault on a member of Her Majesty's Guard." Marcus's face went white as the reality of his actions hit him. The light-hearted prank he had envisioned suddenly felt very different when faced with the guard's stern gaze and the shocked expressions of the surrounding tourists. The coffee cup slipped from his fingers and clattered on the stone pavement. I was just," Marcus stammered, but his words caught in his throat. Palace security officers were already moving toward the scene, their radios crackling with urgent communications. Marcus could see uniformed police officers approaching from multiple directions, their expressions serious and professional. Guard Thompson maintained his gaze on Marcus for another moment before resuming his forward-facing position, but the damage was done. The dark coffee stain on his uniform served as clear evidence of what had transpired, and the gathered crowd provided plenty of witnesses. "Step away from the guard, sir," commanded a security officer who had reached Marcus's side. The man's voice was firm, but not aggressive, suggesting he dealt with tourist incidents regularly. Marcus raised his hands instinctively, his camera still hanging around his neck. "Look, I'm sorry. I didn't mean any harm. It was supposed to be funny." The security officer gestured for Marcus to move away from Guard Thompson, who remained at his post despite his soiled uniform. Other guards had taken notice of the situation but maintained their positions, trusting their colleagues and security personnel to handle the matter. "Sir, I need you to come with me," the security officer said, his hand gently but firmly guiding Marcus by the elbow. As they walked away from the crowd, Marcus could hear the murmur of voices behind him. Some tourists were expressing outrage at his behavior, while others seemed sympathetic to what they perceived as a harmless mistake. His phone, which had been recording the entire incident, was still in his hand. The security officer led Marcus to a small building adjacent to the palace grounds. The structure was modest and official-looking, clearly designed for administrative purposes rather than public tours. Marcus's heart was racing as he realized the serious nature of his situation. "Take a seat," the officer instructed, gesturing to a simple wooden chair in what appeared to be an interview room. The walls were painted institutional green, and a single window offered a view of the palace grounds where tourists continued their sightseeing, oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded. Marcus sat down heavily, his legs suddenly feeling weak. The adrenaline that had fueled his impromptu performance was rapidly giving way to anxiety and regret. He looked down at his hands, which were trembling slightly. "What's your name, sir?" the officer asked, pulling out a notebook. "Marcus Thompson," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "And you're visiting from where?" "Denver, Colorado, United States." The officer made notes as he spoke. "Can you tell me what happened out there, Mr. Thompson?" Marcus took a deep breath, trying to organize his thoughts. I was trying to get a reaction from the guard. I've seen videos online of people trying to make them laugh or break character. I thought it would be funny." "So you threw coffee at him?" "I didn't really think it through," Marcus admitted. "It seemed like a harmless prank at the time. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone." The officer continued writing, his expression neutral but professional. "Mr. Thompson, do you understand that what you did constitutes assault under British law?" The word assault hit Marcus like a physical blow. In his mind, assault involved violence and malicious intent. He had simply thrown coffee. Hot coffee, he now realized with growing horror. "Assault?" Marcus repeated weakly. "Yes, sir. Throwing any substance at another person without their consent, particularly a hot liquid that could cause injury, is considered assault." Marcus felt sick to his stomach. His European vacation, which had started so perfectly, was rapidly turning into a nightmare. He thought about his job back home, his family, and the potential consequences of having an assault charge on his record. "What happens now?" he asked. The officer closed his notebook and looked directly at Marcus. "That depends on several factors, Mr. Thompson. We'll need to take your statement, and there will likely be charges filed. The guard in question will also need to provide his account of the incident." As if summoned by the mention of his name, there was a knock on the door. The security officer opened it to reveal Guard Thompson, now changed out of his stained uniform and dressed in regular military attire. Without his bearskin hat and ceremonial clothing, he looked younger and more approachable, but his expression remained serious. "This is Guard Thompson," the security officer said. "He'll be providing his statement as well." Marcus looked up at the guard he had doused with coffee just an hour earlier. The man's blue eyes were still intense, but Marcus detected something else in them now, perhaps disappointment or even pity. "I want to apologize," Marcus said immediately, standing up from his chair. "I'm really sorry. I know it was stupid." Guard Thompson nodded slightly but didn't respond immediately. He took a seat across from Marcus, and for the first time, Marcus could see him as a person rather than a tourist attraction. "What's your name?" Marcus asked, hoping to humanize the situation. "Private James Thompson," the guard replied formally. "Thompson? Really? That's my last name, too." Private Thompson's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Is it now?" The security officer looked between the two men with interest. "Interesting coincidence. Well, Private Thompson, can you tell me what happened from your perspective?" James Thompson sat straighter in his chair, his military training evident in his posture. "Sir, I was maintaining my post at the palace gates when the civilian approached. He began speaking to me, which is not unusual. However, his behavior became increasingly disruptive as he gathered a crowd." Marcus listened, feeling worse with every word. He then threw a cup of hot coffee directly at my uniform, Private Thompson continued. The liquid was hot enough to cause discomfort through the fabric, though I sustained no actual burns. Were you able to continue your duties? Yes, sir, though I did require a uniform change. The security officer made more notes. And what would you like to see happen regarding this incident, Private Thompson? James Thompson was quiet for a long moment, studying Marcus carefully. Marcus held his breath, knowing that the guard's response could determine the course of his immediate future. Sir, Private Thompson finally said, while the civilian's actions were clearly inappropriate and constitute assault, I believe his intent was not malicious. He appears to be genuinely remorseful. Marcus felt a surge of gratitude but remained silent, not wanting to interrupt. However, Private Thompson continued, actions have consequences. Regardless of intent, the dignity of the guard must be maintained, and tourists need to understand that we are not entertainment props for their amusement. The security officer nodded thoughtfully. A very measured response, Private Thompson. Mr. Marcus Thompson, you're quite fortunate that Private Thompson is being so reasonable about this situation. Marcus nodded vigorously. I am. I really am grateful, and I'm truly sorry. The fact remains, the security officer continued, that charges will need to be filed. However, given Private Thompson's statement and your apparent remorse, we may be able to work something out that doesn't involve jail time. Relief washed over Marcus, though he understood he wasn't out of trouble yet. The officer explained that he would need to remain available for the next several hours while paperwork was processed and statements were finalized. As the formal interview concluded, Marcus found himself alone with Private Thompson for a few minutes while the security officer stepped out to make phone calls. I really am sorry, Marcus said again. I know that doesn't undo what I did, but I want you to know it wasn't personal. James Thompson studied him for a moment before responding. You know, Mr. Thompson, people see us out there and think we're not real people. They think we're just part of the scenery. I didn't think of it that way, Marcus admitted. We have families, feelings, pride in our service, James continued. That uniform I was wearing represents something important to me and to my country. When you threw coffee on it, you weren't just pranking a guard. You were disrespecting something I've worked very hard to earn the right to wear. Marcus felt the weight of those words. I understand that now. I wish I had understood it before. The thing is, James said, leaning back in his chair, I might have done something similar when I was younger. Before I joined the military, before I learned what service really means. This admission surprised Marcus. Really? Really? That's why I'm not pushing for the harshest possible punishment. But you need to understand that there have to be consequences. Marcus nodded solemnly. Whatever they are, I'll accept them. The security officer returned with several forms and a stern expression. Mr. Thompson, you'll be charged with assault, but given the circumstances, it will be treated as a minor offense. You'll need to pay a fine, attend a brief educational session about British law and customs, and perform 20 hours of community service. Marcus felt enormous relief. That's it? That's quite enough, the officer replied firmly. And if you're ever involved in a similar incident anywhere in the United Kingdom, the penalties will be much more severe. As the paperwork was completed, Marcus reflected on how quickly his morning had gone from exciting to terrifying to educational. He looked at Private Thompson, who was preparing to return to his duties. Thank you, Marcus said simply. James Thompson stood and extended his hand. Learn from this, Mr. Thompson, and maybe think twice before treating people like entertainment. They shook hands, and Marcus was struck by the firmness of the guard's grip and the sincerity in his eyes. This young soldier had shown him mercy when he could have made his life very difficult. As Marcus was escorted from the building to begin the process of paying his fine and arranging his community service, he caught a glimpse of the palace grounds where tourists continued to gather around the remaining guards. He noticed that they maintained a more respectful distance than he had, and he wondered if word of his incident had already spread among the crowd. His phone buzzed with notifications. The video he had been recording was automatically uploaded to his cloud storage, and friends back home were already commenting on his social media posts from earlier in the day. He realized he would have quite a story to tell, though probably not the one he had originally planned. The coffee stain on Private Thompson's uniform had been washed away and replaced with a fresh, pristine red coat. But the lesson Marcus had learned would stay with him much longer than any social media post or vacation photo. As he walked away from Buckingham Palace, Marcus Thompson understood that his encounter with Private James Thompson had changed him in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. The Community Service Center in South London was not where Marcus Thompson had expected to spend his Wednesday morning. 3 days had passed since the incident at Buckingham Palace, and the weight of his actions continued to settle in his mind like an unwelcome houseguest. The building was a converted Victorian warehouse, its brick walls painted a cheerful yellow that seemed at odds with Marcus's mood as he approached the entrance. "Marcus Thompson?" asked a woman with graying hair and kind eyes as he walked through the front doors. She wore a badge identifying her as Helen Morrison, volunteer coordinator. "Yes, ma'am. I'm here for my community service assignment." Helen looked him up and down, taking in his nervous expression and the way he fidgeted with his backpack straps. "American tourist, right? The one from the palace incident?" Marcus winced. "Word travels fast." "Faster than you'd think," Helen replied with a slight smile. "Don't worry, dear. You're not the first tourist who's made a poor decision and ended up here. Won't be the last either." She led him through a corridor lined with bulletin boards covered in colorful flyers advertising various community programs. The building hummed with activity. Marcus could hear voices from multiple rooms, the sound of children laughing, and what sounded like a cooking class in session. "This is where you'll be working," Helen said, stopping at a doorway that opened into a large room filled with elderly people seated at round tables. Some were reading newspapers, others were playing cards, and a few were engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion about cricket scores. "A senior center?" Marcus asked. "The Southwark Senior Community Center, to be precise. We serve about 200 elderly residents from the surrounding neighborhoods. Many of them live alone and don't have much regular social contact." Marcus surveyed the room, feeling out of place among the white-haired residents who seemed so comfortable in their environment. "What exactly will I be doing?" "Whatever needs doing," Helen replied matter-of-factly. "Serving meals, helping with activities, cleaning up, listening to stories. These folks have lived fascinating lives, Mr. Thompson. You might learn something if you pay attention." As Helen introduced him to the center's staff, Marcus couldn't help but think about how surreal his situation had become. 4 days ago, he had been planning tourist activities and worrying about getting good photos for Instagram. Now he was preparing to spend 20 hours serving meals to elderly Londoners as punishment for assaulting a royal guard. "And this is where you'll start," Helen said, leading him to the kitchen. A large woman wearing an apron and hairnet looked up from the industrial-sized pot she was stirring. "This is Margaret," Helen said. "She runs the kitchen with an iron fist, so mind your manners." Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and gave Marcus a appraising look. "So you're the one who threw coffee at the guard, eh?" Marcus's face reddened. "News really does travel fast here." "Faster than the tube during rush hour," Margaret chuckled. "Well, no worries, love. We've all done stupid things when we were young. The important thing is what you do afterward." For the next several hours, Marcus found himself immersed in the rhythms of the senior center. He helped Margaret prepare and serve lunch, which consisted of shepherd's pie, mushy peas, and bread pudding that smelled heavenly. The elderly residents were more welcoming than he had expected, many of them eager to chat with the young American visitor. "Whereabouts in America are you from?" asked George, a spry 82-year-old with twinkling eyes and a thick Cockney accent. Denver, Colorado, Marcus replied as he placed a plate in front of George. Ah, cowboy country. I was stationed in Colorado Springs during the war. Beautiful mountains there. You were in the military? Royal Air Force for 23 years. Started as a mechanic, worked my way up to sergeant. Best years of my life, those were. As Marcus continued serving meals, he found himself drawn into conversations with the residents. Each person had stories to tell about the war, about raising families in post-war London, about careers and adventures and losses that had shaped their lives. The hours passed more quickly than he had anticipated. During the afternoon break, Marcus sat with a group of residents who were discussing current events. The conversation inevitably turned to the royal family and recent happenings at the palace. "Heard there was some trouble with a tourist the other day," mentioned Dorothy, a former nurse who spoke with the authority of someone who had seen everything. "Threw coffee at one of the guards," they said. Marcus nearly choked on the tea he was drinking. "Really? What did you hear about it?" "Oh, the usual," Dorothy continued. "Some young person thinking they could get away with treating our guards like circus performers. Proper shame, if you ask me." Several other residents nodded in agreement. Marcus felt his face burning with embarrassment, but also found himself curious about their perspectives. "What do you think should have happened to whoever did it?" he asked carefully. "Prison," said Frank, a retired dock worker with scarred hands and a no-nonsense expression. "That uniform represents something. Can't have tourists thinking they can disrespect it." "Oh, Frank, you're always so harsh," Dorothy chided. "Maybe they just didn't understand. Americans don't have the same relationship with tradition that we do." "That's no excuse for bad behavior," Frank shot back. George, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke up. "You know, I think the important thing is whether the person learned from their mistake. Prison doesn't teach lessons, it just punishes. But community service, now that's different." "Makes you think about how your actions affect other people?" Marcus looked at George with new appreciation. "You really think community service is better than prison?" "Absolutely. When I was young and stupid, and I was both, mind you, my father made me work in a soup kitchen for a month after I got caught stealing cigarettes. Changed my whole perspective on things." The conversation continued for another hour, with Marcus asking careful questions about British customs, military traditions, and the role of the royal family in modern society. He began to understand that his actions at the palace had touched on something deeper than just tourist behavior. They had challenged symbols and traditions that held real meaning for these people. As the day wound down, Marcus helped clean the dining room and prepare for the next day's activities. Margaret assigned him to sweep the floors, and as he worked, he found himself thinking about Private Thompson and wondering how the guard's day had gone. "You're quiet," Margaret observed as she wiped down tables nearby. "Just thinking," Marcus replied. "About what happened at the palace." Marcus stopped sweeping and looked at her in surprise. "How did you know?" Margaret laughed. "Oh, honey, it wasn't hard to figure out. You've been asking questions about the royal family all day, and you get this guilty look every time someone mentions tourists behaving badly." Marcus leaned on his broom handle and sighed. "Was I that obvious? To someone who's raised 5 children?" "Absolutely." Margaret sat down at one of the tables and gestured for Marcus to join her. "Want to talk about it?" For the first time since the incident, Marcus found himself telling the complete story to someone who didn't already know the details. Margaret listened without interruption as he described his thought process, his growing audience, and the moment when he threw the coffee. "I keep thinking about what the guard said," Marcus finished. "About how I was treating him like he wasn't a real person." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "That's the thing about uniforms, isn't it? They make people forget there's a human being underneath." I guess I never thought about it that way. The folks here at the center, they understand that better than most. Half of them spent their careers in uniforms of one kind or another. Military, police, nurses, postal workers. They know what it's like to have people see the job instead of the person. Margaret's words resonated with Marcus as he finished his cleaning duties. When Helen Morrison found him at the end of the day, she seemed pleased with his progress. "How was your first day?" she asked. "Educational," Marcus replied honestly. "Good. That's what we're hoping for. You'll be back tomorrow?" "Yes, ma'am. Same time?" "Same time." "And Marcus? The residents seem to like you. George asked if you'd be willing to help him with a computer problem tomorrow. Apparently, he wants to email his grandson in Australia but can't figure out how to attach photos." Marcus smiled. "I'd be happy to help." As he walked to the tube station, Marcus reflected on how different this day had been from what he had expected. Instead of feeling punished, he felt engaged. The residents at the center had challenged his assumptions about elderly people, just as Private Thompson had challenged his assumptions about guards. His phone buzzed with messages from friends back home who had seen news reports about the incident online. The story had apparently made international news as a humorous example of tourist misbehavior. Several friends had sent him links to articles with headlines like "American Tourist Learns Hard Lesson at Buckingham Palace" and "Coffee-Throwing Tourist Gets Taste of British Justice." Reading the articles, Marcus was struck by how they portrayed the incident as a simple case of an ignorant American making a fool of himself. The complexity of what he was experiencing, the community service, the conversations with residents, the deeper understanding of British culture he was gaining, was completely absent from the media coverage. That evening, back at his hotel, Marcus found himself researching the history of the Royal Guards. He learned about their training, their traditions, and their role beyond just tourist attractions. He read about young soldiers like Private Thompson, who dedicated years of their lives to upholding these traditions. He also researched the senior center where he was serving his community service. The Southwark Senior Community Center had been serving elderly residents for over 30 years, providing meals, social activities, and support services for some of London's most vulnerable citizens. Many of the people he had met that day were living on limited pensions and relied on the center for both nutrition and companionship. The more Marcus learned, the more he understood that his punishment was really an opportunity. He was being given a chance to see London through the eyes of people who had lived there their entire lives, to understand the culture he had inadvertently disrespected from the inside. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the center early and found George already waiting for him with a laptop computer that looked at least 10 years old. "Right then," George said with a grin. "Let's see if you can help an old dog learn some new tricks." For the next hour, Marcus patiently walked George through the process of creating email attachments, uploading photos, and navigating various computer programs. George was a quick learner despite his claims about his age, and soon he was successfully sending photos of London landmarks to his grandson in Melbourne. "Brilliant," George exclaimed as the email went through. "He'll be so surprised to hear from me. Usually takes me weeks to get around to writing letters." "It's much faster this way," Marcus agreed. "You know," George said, leaning back in his chair, "you're all right, you are. Whoever you are and whatever you've done, you're all right." Marcus felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. "Thank you, George. That means a lot." As the days passed, Marcus settled into a routine at the center. He arrived each morning ready to help with whatever needed doing and gradually became a familiar face among the residents. Dorothy taught him how to play bridge, Frank shared stories from his days working the London docks, and Margaret showed him how to prepare traditional British dishes in quantities large enough to feed an army. But it was his ongoing conversations with George that affected him most deeply. The elderly veteran had a way of asking questions that made Marcus think about his life and choices in new ways. "What do you do back in America?" George asked one afternoon as they worked together in the center's small garden. "Marketing," Marcus replied. "I work for a company that sells outdoor equipment." "Do you like it?" Marcus paused in his weeding to consider the question. "I thought I did, but lately I'm not so sure." "What's changed?" "I don't know. Maybe I have. This whole experience, the incident at the palace, working here, meeting all of you, it's made me think about what's really important." George nodded knowingly. "Travel has a way of doing that. Changes your perspective on things." "Have you traveled much?" "Oh, bits and pieces. Military took me all over during my service years. But you know what I learned? The most important journeys happen right here." George tapped his chest. "In your heart and mind." That evening, Marcus called his parents for the first time since the incident. He had been dreading the conversation, knowing they would have heard about his legal troubles through news reports or social media. "Marcus!" His mother's voice came through clearly despite the distance. "We've been so worried. Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Mom." Better than fine, actually. He spent the next hour telling them about his community service, the people he had met, and the perspectives he was gaining on life and responsibility. His parents listened with a mixture of relief and pride as they realized their son was using his mistake as an opportunity for growth. "You sound different," his father observed. "I feel different. This whole experience has been humbling, but also incredible. I'm learning so much about myself and about what matters." As Marcus prepared for bed that night, he realized he had only a few more days of community service remaining. The thought filled him with unexpected sadness. He had grown attached to the residents at the center, and the idea of leaving them behind when his sentence was complete felt like abandoning new friends. He thought about Private Thompson and wondered if the guard ever thought about their encounter. Marcus had considered returning to Buckingham Palace to apologize again, but he wasn't sure if that would be appropriate or welcome. His laptop showed several new friend requests on social media from people who had seen the news coverage, most of them seeking details about his experience or hoping to connect with someone who had become briefly famous. Marcus ignored them all, feeling protective of the privacy and dignity of the real story he was living. Instead, he opened a new document and began writing. He wasn't sure if he would ever share it, but he felt compelled to record his thoughts about the experience, the lessons he was learning, and the people who were teaching them to him. 3 weeks ago, he wrote, "I thought I was just a tourist looking for a good story. I had no idea that the story would end up being about me, or that the best parts would happen far away from any tourist attraction." As he continued writing, Marcus reflected on how much his understanding of London, of Britain, and of himself had changed in just a few days. The coffee-throwing incident that had seemed so embarrassing and problematic was beginning to feel like the beginning of something much more significant. Tomorrow would bring another day at the center, another opportunity to serve people who had given him far more than he could ever give them in return. And for the first time since his arrest, Marcus Thompson was genuinely grateful for the consequences of his actions. Marcus Thompson's final day of community service dawned gray and drizzly, typical London weather that seemed to match his mixed emotions. After 2 weeks at the Southwark Senior Community Center, he had grown so attached to the residents and staff that leaving felt like saying goodbye to family members. As he walked through the familiar yellow doors one last time as a required volunteer, Marcus carried with him a small wrapped package and a heart full of gratitude. "Last day, then?" Margaret asked as he entered the kitchen, her usual cheerful demeanor tinged with genuine sadness. "Last day," Marcus confirmed, tying on his apron for what he knew would be the final time. "I can't believe how quickly it's gone by." "Time flies when you're making a difference," Margaret replied, handing him a large spoon to begin stirring the porridge. "The residents are going to miss you something fierce." As the morning progressed, Marcus found himself savoring each interaction, each conversation, each moment of the routine he had come to love. George greeted him with his customary enthusiasm, eager to show off the latest email he had received from his grandson in Australia. Dorothy had prepared a special bridge game in his honor, and Frank, despite his gruff exterior, had actually brought Marcus a small Union Jack pin as a farewell gift. "So you don't forget us," Frank said gruffly, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he handed over the pin. "I could never forget you," Marcus replied, genuinely moved by the gesture. "Any of you." During lunch service, Helen Morrison pulled Marcus aside with news that would change his understanding of the entire situation. "Marcus, I have someone here who would like to speak with you," she said, leading him toward the center's small office. Sitting in the chair across from Helen's desk was Private James Thompson, dressed in civilian clothes but unmistakable despite the absence of his red uniform. Marcus's heart began racing as memories of their previous encounter flooded back. "Private Thompson," Marcus said, extending his hand nervously. "I wasn't expecting to see you again." James stood and shook Marcus's hand firmly. "Please call me James, and I wanted to see how your community service was going." "You wanted to see how it was going?" Marcus repeated, confused. "Why?" Helen gestured for both men to sit down before speaking. "Marcus, there's something you should know about your assignment here. When offenders are sentenced to community service, they can be placed in any number of facilities around London. The decision about where to send you specifically was made by James." Marcus looked between Helen and James, trying to process this information. "You chose where I would serve?" "I requested that you be placed here specifically," James confirmed. "This center has special meaning to me." "I don't understand." James was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "My grandfather, William Thompson, was a resident here for the last 3 years of his life. He passed away 6 months ago." Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. "Your grandfather lived here?" "Not lived here, he lived in a small flat nearby. But he came here every day for meals, for company, for the activities. After my grandmother died, this place became his entire world. The staff and residents here weren't just his community, they were his family." Helen nodded, her eyes soft with memory. "William was one of our most beloved residents, always helping others, always ready with a kind word or a funny story. When I heard about your case," James continued, "and I had the opportunity to make a recommendation about your community service placement, I thought about what my grandfather would have wanted. He always believed that people deserved second chances, that mistakes could become opportunities for growth." Marcus sat in stunned silence, overwhelmed by the revelation. "So you sent me here because of your grandfather?" "I sent you here because I thought you might learn what I learned from him. That real honor comes from service to others, especially those who need it most." The weight of James's words settled over Marcus like a warm blanket. All these weeks, he had thought he was simply paying a debt to society, serving his punishment for an embarrassing mistake. He hadn't realized he was fulfilling a deeper purpose, one connected to the very person he had wronged. "Did you know?" Marcus asked Helen. "About the connection?" "James told me when he made the request," Helen replied, "but he asked that we not tell you unless you completed your service successfully. He wanted you to discover the value of this place on your own." Marcus turned back to James, his mind reeling. "Why didn't you tell me from the beginning?" "Because it wouldn't have meant anything if you knew. The lessons you've learned here, the relationships you've built, they're real because you experienced them authentically. If you had known about my grandfather from the start, you might have approached everything differently." "But I might not have learned anything at all," Marcus protested. "I could have just gone through the motions, counted down the days until I was free to leave." James smiled, the first genuine smile Marcus had seen from him. "But you didn't, did you?" Helen tells me you've been one of their most dedicated volunteers. The residents adore you, and you've made a real difference here. Over the next hour, James shared stories about his grandfather's time at the center. William Thompson had been a Royal Navy veteran who had served during World War II, losing his left arm in a submarine attack in the North Atlantic. Despite his disability, he had spent his later years volunteering at various charities around London, always insisting that he had been given more than he had given. He used to say that the measure of a person wasn't what they achieved when everything was going well, James related. It was what they chose to do when they faced adversity or made mistakes. Marcus thought about his own response to adversity, the panic, the embarrassment, the initial resistance to his community service assignment. Then he thought about how his perspective had shifted over the weeks, how he had come to cherish his time at the center and the people he had met there. "I wish I could have met him," Marcus said sincerely. "In a way, you did," Helen interjected. "George served on the same ship as William during the war. They remained friends for 70 years. This revelation added another layer to Marcus's understanding of the connections that had shaped his experience. George, who had become his closest friend at the center, had been William Thompson's shipmate and lifelong companion. The computer lessons, the gardening sessions, the long conversations about life and purpose, all of it had been influenced by a friendship that spanned decades. "George never mentioned it," Marcus said. "I asked him not to," James admitted. "Again, I wanted you to form your own relationship with him." As their conversation continued, Marcus learned more about the Thompson family's military tradition. James's father had served in the Army, and his older brother was currently deployed with the Royal Marines in the Mediterranean. The red uniform that Marcus had stained with coffee represented not just personal achievement, but generational commitment to service and duty. "When you threw that coffee at me," James said, "my first instinct was anger, just like any person would feel. But then I remembered something my grandfather always said about Americans." "What was that?" "He said Americans were impulsive and sometimes rude, but they were also generous and capable of great kindness when they understood what was needed." Marcus felt a complex mixture of embarrassment and gratitude. "Your grandfather sounds like a wise man." "He was, and he would have been proud to see how you've conducted yourself here over these past 2 weeks. Before leaving the center that day, Marcus asked to address the residents one final time. Helen gathered everyone in the main dining room, and Marcus stood before the group of elderly faces that had become so dear to him. "I came here 2 weeks ago as punishment for a stupid mistake I made," he began, his voice slightly shaky with emotion. "I was angry about having to give up my vacation time, angry about the embarrassment, angry about the consequences of my actions." The room was completely quiet. Everyone's attention focused on the young American who had become such an integral part of their daily routine. "What I didn't expect was to find a second family here. You've taught me more about dignity, service, and genuine friendship than I learned in 28 years before walking through those doors." He pulled the wrapped package from his backpack and handed it to George. "This is for all of you to share. It's not much, but I wanted to leave something behind." George unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a professional photo album filled with pictures Marcus had taken during his time at the center. Each page showed residents engaged in various activities, playing cards, preparing meals, working in the garden, laughing together over shared stories. "You captured all of us," Dorothy said softly, tears in her eyes as she looked through the album. "You captured the soul of this place," Margaret added. As Marcus made his final rounds, saying individual goodbyes to each person who had touched his life, he realized that his punishment had become the most meaningful experience of his adult life. The 20 hours of community service mandated by the court had stretched into nearly 40 hours of voluntary participation, and he found himself wondering how he could continue his connection to the center from across the Atlantic. James walked with Marcus to the tube station, their conversation continuing as they navigated the busy London streets. "What happens when you go back to America?" James asked. "I'm not sure," Marcus replied honestly. "My job, my whole life. It all seems different now. Less important in some ways, more important in others." "How so?" "Before this, I was focused on building my career, making money, gaining followers on social media, all very individual pursuits. But these past 2 weeks have shown me what it feels like to be part of something bigger than myself." They reached the station entrance, where other commuters rushed past them in the eternal London hurry. James extended his hand one final time. "Thank you, Marcus, for taking this seriously, for honoring my grandfather's memory, whether you knew it or not, and for proving that my faith in second chances was justified." "Thank you for giving me the chance to prove it," Marcus replied, "and for helping me understand what service really means." As James disappeared into the crowd, Marcus stood for a moment watching the flow of people around him. Each person was carrying their own story, their own burdens, their own opportunities for connection and service. For the first time, he saw the city not as a tourist attraction, but as a community of individuals, each deserving of respect and consideration. The flight back to Denver gave Marcus hours to reflect on his transformed perspective. He had arrived in London as a tourist, seeking memorable experiences and social media content. He was leaving as someone who understood the difference between being entertained and being educated, between taking photos and making connections, between seeking attention and providing service. His co-workers welcomed him back with a mixture of curiosity and good-natured teasing about his legal troubles. The story had indeed gone viral, with various versions circulating on social media platforms around the world. But Marcus found himself uninterested in discussing the sensational aspects of the incident. Instead, he focused on the relationships he had formed and the lessons he had learned. "So, what was it like?" asked his friend Sarah over coffee during his first week back at work. "Life-changing," Marcus replied simply. "Really? Community service at an old folks' home?" Marcus smiled, remembering Margaret's fierce protectiveness over her kitchen, George's pride in mastering email technology, and Dorothy's competitive bridge strategies. "Really?" Over the following months, Marcus maintained regular email contact with George and several other residents. He sent photos from Colorado, shared updates about his life, and continued their conversations about everything from world events to family relationships. The time difference meant their exchanges were often delayed, but the connection remained strong. More importantly, Marcus began volunteering at a senior center near his home in Denver. The work felt familiar and comfortable after his London experience, and he found himself approaching it with skills and perspectives he had gained at Southwark. The elderly residents there appreciated his patience and genuine interest in their stories, though they couldn't understand why he seemed to know so much about British customs and military traditions. 6 months after his return, Marcus received an unexpected package in his mail. Inside was a letter from Helen Morrison and a small Union Jack pin identical to the one Frank had given him. "Dear Marcus," the letter read, "I wanted you to know that George passed away peacefully last month. He spoke of you often in his final weeks and asked that we send you this pin, which belonged to his dear friend William Thompson. George said William would have wanted you to have it, and that you would understand its significance." Marcus held the small pin in his palm, feeling the weight of history and friendship it represented. 3 generations of Thompsons, William the war veteran, James the Royal Guard, and George the loyal friend, had shaped his understanding of honor, service, and human connection. He pinned the Union Jack to the bulletin board above his desk at work, where it served as a daily reminder of the lessons he had learned and the people who had taught them. Colleagues who asked about it received abbreviated explanations about his London experience. But Marcus kept the deeper significance to himself. The marketing job that had once seemed so important gradually became less satisfying. Marcus found himself drawn to opportunities that involved service and human connection rather than profit and promotion. When a position opened up with a nonprofit organization focused on veteran services, he didn't hesitate to apply. "Why do you want to work with veterans?" the interviewer asked during his final interview. Marcus thought about James Thompson standing in his stained uniform, maintaining his dignity despite embarrassment. He thought about William Thompson serving his country and then serving his community until the end of his life. He thought about George Thompson carrying on traditions of friendship and service across decades. "Because I've learned that real honor comes from serving others," Marcus replied, "and veterans understand that better than most people." A year after the coffee-throwing incident that had seemed so catastrophic, Marcus Thompson was working as a program coordinator for a veterans assistance nonprofit, volunteering regularly at a senior center, and maintaining friendships that spanned continents. The viral video of his mistake still existed somewhere on the internet, but it no longer defined him. Instead, he was defined by the relationships he had built, the service he provided, and the understanding he had gained about dignity, honor, and the complex connections that bind people together across differences of nationality, generation, and circumstance. The coffee stain had long since been cleaned from Private James Thompson's uniform, but the impact of that moment continued to ripple outward in ways neither man could have anticipated. What had begun as a thoughtless prank had become a story of redemption, connection, and the transformative power of second chances. When people asked Marcus about his most memorable travel experience, he no longer talked about tourist attractions or photo opportunities. Instead, he talked about a gray building in South London where he had learned that the most important journeys happen not in exotic locations, but in the moments when we choose to see others as fully human and deserving of our respect, service, and love. The story that had started with a cup of coffee thrown in disrespect had ended with connections forged in understanding, service offered in gratitude, and a life transformed by the simple act of taking responsibility for one's actions and their consequences. Marcus Thompson had indeed gotten his viral moment and his memorable London story, but the version he treasured had nothing to do with cameras or social media, and everything to do with the quiet dignity of ordinary people living lives of extraordinary meaning.